In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the connection between Europeans and the Native Americans from an economic standpoint. So, to get your mind thinking about what I'm talking about, you have to imagine what it was like for Native Americans prior to European interaction, settlement, exploration. So we can't say that all Native Americans experienced the exact same situation. I mean, there were different tribes throughout the whole country, and some tribes interacted with each other in a positive way. Some didn't even have any communication whatsoever because there was no need to leave one's own region. And if we think of specifically the Northeast, for a good deal of history, the Native Americans of the Northeast, although they had tribal identification, they didn't necessarily look at each tribe as being a separate country. And this is key to understand because unlike Europe or Asia, where there were boundaries of land which created large empires, small empires, land was all was important, controlling towns and people, and the Native Americans didn't have that same sense of ownership of empire. They also didn't have a grandiose plan of uniting all Native Americans under a single banner which would give them more power. So, in essence, the Native Americans were living in a world in which it was important to maintain peace and order. War did exist, unfortunately, like in every civilization. But the wars were fought over more necessary things. The war over land was not necessarily the fighting goal. The war over access to water, perhaps. The war over disputes between tribes, but not to expand land as much. And yes, throughout history, there had been times where Native American tribes had taken in other tribes as part of confederations. And the best example is the Iroquois Confederation, where there were 6 tribes of upstate New York which united under a single banner, still keeping their individual identity, but working together for mutual benefits. It really wasn't until the Europeans came where Native Americans really started to divide along European nation lines. So imagine the 2 major tribes of southern New England, which were the Pequot tribe and the Mohican tribe. When the Native Americans started trading with the Dutch, you had the Pequot tribe, which they became really close with the Dutch. They allied with the Dutch. And you had the Mohican tribe, which started trading with the British when the British came to Plymouth. These 2 tribes, the Pequots and the Mohicans, were once the same tribe. They once were the same sachem, the same chiefdom. It was the British and Dutch allegiance that divided this nation, which created a rift between these 2 nations. So if we think about that as a starting point, that Native Americans come from a different perspective than Europe, we can start to understand the economic connections between the 2 nations. So let's take a look at the Europeans for a minute. Europeans are coming from a world in which they have enclosure. Land is owned by individuals. Land was typically owned by the king, who gave it to his knights and earls and his nobles. And those nobles then would have serfs living on the land. And eventually, if the serfs became wealthy enough, they could buy a section of land. But land ownership was very expensive. Most people didn't own land. They mostly worked on someone else's land, and they paid a percentage of their crops to a knight or a lord, and the lord paid to the king. So that was the concept of feudalism that went on throughout Europe. Now, when you're getting to American settlement, you're getting people who have experienced this feudalism. For the most part, you have some wealthy people who want to continue that trend in America. But you have others who, they want land, they want independence, they want to be able to make something of themselves. So when they're coming to this country, they're thinking, I'm going to take what I can, because I couldn't do that in Europe. And if I can buy it, I'm going to buy it. And it's not going to be that expensive because no one else really is in demand for it. It's not in high demand like it is in Europe, where land is very high in demand. And when the British and the Dutch and the French come, they realize very quickly that the natives, they don't have a concept really of land ownership. So because these 2 philosophies don't really work together, what you end up having is that Native Americans are willing to negotiate for land ownership for things that they need. So let's think about what are things that the Native Americans need. Up to this point, Native Americans, although their technology, I wouldn't call it primitive, right? Don't think that the Native Americans were living in the Stone Age in terms of everything was very simplistic and the Europeans came and just brought them up to this modern age. Europeans had more of a metal concept, but the Native Americans had a very advanced technology society. But they didn't have to make things out of stone. They didn't have the metal working concept. They didn't have the smelting of ore in order to get metals, in order to make tools. So when Europeans start to come and they start to bring things like pots, Native Americans look at the pots and go, what is that hard stuff that's malleable also that we can turn into other things? So it's not so much they needed a pot, they wanted the metal. So they could take that metal and turn it into something they've already used for thousands of years, but now it's sharper and it's easier to make. Where it took them 2 weeks to make an arrowhead out of stone, it's going to take them 2 days to make an arrowhead out of metal. When it took them months to make a knife out of stone the proper way and the sharpness, it's going to take them just a week with metal. So just by enhancing that one thing, that's going to drive Native Americans to want to negotiate with Europeans. Eventually you're going to see things like guns, once you get more warring between tribes. You're going to see alcohol, once Native Americans realize its potential, and other things that the Native Americans they can't get on their own, because they are still a very dependent people on the Europeans for these items once they become connected to Europe. Now beyond land, there are some things that the Europeans can't get very easily, and some of those things include food. So to negotiate, to give somebody something very simple like a pot or something very cheap in Europe, and to get food in return, is meaningless for the European. For the Native American, that's huge. I'm going to give them something that I can do very easily, grow food, help them to grow food, and then I'm going to get something like a pot, which I could never figure out how to make on my own because I don't know how the technology. Now eventually you're going to get some tribes that are not going to want to necessarily barter, but they're going to start engaging in the trade of wampum, which is what the British referred to it as. Wampum was a currency that was used by a lot of Native American tribes in the Northeast. And this wampum was a series of beads and shells that were put onto a string. And the string was long, and depending on how many pieces of wampum you had, there was a certain value to it. So although they didn't have a money system, this wampum was traded like a money. So what you ended up having is that, let's say the British would come to a tribe, and they would trade them pots. And for those pots, these natives would give them wampum, which was considered very valuable to the natives. They would then take this wampum and go to a secondary tribe who specialized in hunting for fur, trade them the wampum, and they would get the beaver pelts. So in essence, what you had was an economy that was very symbiotic. The natives needed the Europeans, and the Europeans needed the natives. Now eventually, once the Europeans start to learn how to hunt on their own easily, where they find more and more furs, they don't need the natives as much. They don't need to trade their goods with the natives anymore. Now you're in a situation in which for 60 to 100 years, Native Americans have become dependent on Europeans, and now Europeans are backing away saying, we don't need to trade with you because we figured it out on our own. Even though you helped us in the past, we don't really need your help anymore. This angered Native Americans, because now Native Americans didn't have what they needed. In 100 years of time, they're not in the technology of making things out of stone anymore. They can't go backwards 100 years now and do things the way that their grandparents did. They have to do things the way they know how to. So as the shortness of traded items with the Native Americans increased aggression, there was more raids of Native Americans on European villages. So you get things like the Pequot War, which was a war where Native Americans were attacking traders. And you wonder, why were these battles going on? It was this growing animosity between who was trading with who was getting what, which European tribes were trading with which Native American groups, which European groups traded with which sachems. And depending on their alliances, now you had Native American tribes which were against each other because they knew that they were allied to the enemy, the one who wouldn't trade with them. This led to a massive Pequot War, which the Pequots were basically decimated and were ensconced into the Mohican tribe. And to this day, there's really very few Pequots that are left. I mean, we think of the two major casinos in Connecticut, the Mohegan Sun, and you think of Foxwoods, which is run by the Pequot tribe. So the Mohegan tribe and the Pequots still live in Connecticut, still those two major tribes of the southern Connecticut. But again, today we have this reservation system because we forced the natives into this this agreement that they would give up their land because they still needed things that they weren't getting through their old trading system. So what I want you to think about, why this is so important, is to reflect that the Native Americans and the Europeans had a symbiotic relationship. They did need each other. The natives would not have been able to enhance their way of life without European goods, and the Europeans would have not been able to establish their colonies without the help of Native American farmers and fishermen and hunters for trading and trapping. So as it is, by the time we get closer to the French and Indian War, we're reaching a time in which, first, most Native Americans have died from smallpox. It was a huge smallpox outbreak. But most Native Americans have been pushed off their lands further and further into the West, and they're willing to work with whoever is willing to trade with them. And as we start to look at the French and Indian War in the next chapter, you're going to see that the French are more willing to trade with these native tribes. So the British don't have as many natives on their side. And that's why it's called the French and Indian War. It's the Indians, many of the Indian tribes teaming up with the French in the Ohio country in the West against the British, who are now leaning off of the Indians and becoming more self-sufficient. So economics is economics regardless if you're talking about modern day, you're talking about 400, 300 years ago. There's supply and demand. People are willing to supply, they demand what they want. Once the supply is cut off, they still demand the goods. If they're not going to get that supply, people are willing to do whatever it takes. It's opportunity cost. Are you willing to wage a war in order to get those things that you need in order to sustain your people? So as we think about this connection between Native Americans and Europeans, we can't think that the Native Americans and Europeans simply were against each other because the Europeans thought that the natives were devils and the Native Americans couldn't get along with the Europeans. It was very much connected to economics and trade, and it was the mercantilist policies, the way the British changed their interactions with Native Americans, which caused the rift between most Native American tribes and the British people.